Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share a screen here, and we're going to get rolling. So welcome, everybody. Let me get some stuff up on the screen here. I got to find which one it is. Let's do that. And this. All right. Anybody want to give me a couple thumbs up just so I know you're seeing what I hope you're seeing, which is slideshow. I see Eric and Baby give me a thumbs up. Awesome. All right. Well, let's get going here then. It is a little after 9 o'clock. Some people are in the waiting room, but I'll get them in a few minutes. But really happy to have everybody here for the 8th version of this conference. I'm very excited about it. This is actually the split 4 and 4 of we had 4 years where this was face-to-face, 4 years where this has been virtual, mostly due to COVID. And I think I kind of like the virtual version of this because it allows a lot more people to attend, and it doesn't really involve a whole lot of travel. But regardless, happy to see everybody here. And as you come and go during the day, that is perfectly okay. So here's how today's going to go. Oops. Here's how today is going to go. Let me show you what our program looks like. And I'm going to ask for Zoom thumbs up here again to make sure everybody is seeing what I'm hoping you see. I want everybody to take a peek at our program. And so did my share screen move over to the actual program? Is that what you're seeing? Okay. So very briefly, because I know you've all hopefully gotten a chance to look at the program, I'm really excited to introduce Seth here in a couple minutes. He'll give our first keynote. So that'll be roughly 45 minutes and then some good Q&A time afterwards. I've changed our schedule a little bit. Those of you that have been to this meeting before, we're going to jump right from the keynote into half of the 6 poster presentations. One of the pieces of feedback I've gotten over the last couple of years is that the poster session over lunchtime is a little wonky, where it's hard to eat your lunch while you're also trying to interact with poster speakers and all that kind of stuff. So we tweak things just a bit. So immediately after Seth's presentation and the Q&A, we're going to jump right into the poster session, and 3 of the 6 people presenting posters will be there. So it'll be half of that group, and I think that'll allow maybe a little more interaction and more people to be at those posters. Now, it's kind of important for y'all to interact with the poster presenters, because I am giving out awards to what the attendees at the meeting view as the best of the posters. So at the end of the meeting, I'm going to ask y'all to fill out a survey just for feedback about the event, but you're also going to have an opportunity to let me know which posters stood out to you, and those people are going to get awards. Now, the way that works is that this link right here is to what's called a Google Jamboard, and the posters themselves are in that link. I'm not going to open it right now, but basically you can scroll through all of the actual posters, the PDFs of the posters, through that thing called Google Jamboard. I know I'll get chats if somehow that doesn't go correctly. But that's how you'll be able to see the posters. The presenters themselves can actually share their screen and show their posters too, if they'd like. But if you want control over browsing through all the posters, you can do that. We will have breakout rooms, and what you'll find is in each of the slides, the slide itself says which breakout room the presentation is in. So we'll navigate that when we get a little bit closer. But that'll be right after our first keynote, and then we'll have about a 15-minute break. So I'm trying to, be cognizant that we're all at our computers, here for like 7 hours today, maybe. So we'll have about a 15-minute morning break after the keynote and those posters. So a little bit of a break, and then we'll have our first 2 concurrent sessions of a total of 6 talks. So please note that some of the talks are in breakout room 1, some of the talks will be in breakout room 2, and so you'll have the ability to navigate back and forth between those rooms if you want. You can choose where you get to be. I can also help navigate that if I can be helpful if your Zoom isn't cooperating with you. I can move anybody I want. I can kick you out if I want to, but I don't think I'll have to do that. So that'll be the morning concurrent sessions. The afternoon is going to work the exact same way. We'll have 2 concurrent sessions of 4 talks. Again, breakout room 1, breakout room 2. So hopefully that makes sense. What you'll notice at the top of the program, if you hadn't seen that, is if you'd like to see the abstracts for the talks themselves, you can browse that and determine, what you want to see, what you want to hear. Let's see here. We are going to have a lunch break from 12 to 12:45. I am literally going to turn off the Zoom during that period. So go outside, go for a walk, go do non-computer screen things during that time. There will be nobody around. But when we come back at 12:45, we'll have the second half of our poster session. So same idea there with those three presenters. Another short break after that, and then I'll introduce Brian as our second keynote speaker, Brian McDonald. He'll be great also. Same idea there, 45-minute talk with a bunch of Q&A afterwards. We'll have that second concurrent session, and then basically after that, we'll kind of wrap things up with some concluding remarks. So that's our schedule. Let me switch back to my thingamajigger here. I'm not navigating this very well, so bear with me. There we go. So talked a little bit about the program, so I hope that makes sense. Please use your chat, and if you have questions, please let me know if there are any things I can clarify. But our keynote speakers, Seth Partnow and Brian McDonald, really looking forward to them. We've talked a little bit about the poster sessions. The schedule, if you need to jot it down here, I think most of you have seen it anyway. It's in all the emails that I've been sending you, but tinyurl.com/msam23sked is the link to the program in case you need to see that. As we go along today, I do hope you'll help me promote this event in terms of using some of the Twitter or X, excuse me, sorry, I didn't get that edited correctly there. But if you'd like to tag us on Twitter, I love screenshots of talks. I love comments about things that you're seeing, things that are going well. If you have critiques, you can kind of keep that to yourself. But please feel free to use Twitter to promote what's going on today, because it's good to hear from y'all on that. I think beyond that, at the end of the meeting, I'll get some feedback from you. There will be a brief survey that I'll ask you all to fill out. But beyond that, I think we're kind of good to go here. Let me close this up. If there are things I can clarify, I'm keeping an eye on the chat here, but if there's anything I can clarify before we get going, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. We got a couple minutes before we get rolling with Seth's talk. So I'll give it a second to see if anybody puts anything in the chat. Cool. Okay, well, I'm not hearing any questions. And again, we've got a couple minutes here, and I tried to build in a little bit of time. I am going to put a few people on the spot here. I never assume that everyone's here for the entire meeting, right? 7 hours at your computer can be fun, right? We're all sports data nerds. But I know y'all can come and go as you wish. I do want to put our poster presenters on the spot here for just a second. I wonder if those of you that are here, and I'll call you out by name here in a second, if you're here and maybe can give like a 10 to 15 second, hey, here's what my here's what my poster is about. I think it'd be good to maybe advertise that just a bit if you're willing to speak up on that. So again, just a little 10 to 15 second elevator promo for your poster if you're here and you're willing to do that. So I'm gonna call some folks out if you'll allow me to do that. So I'm trying to go in order of the posters in the schedule here. Danny Barris, are you here? I'm looking at names and I'm not good at seeing this on the list. I don't think Danny is here. So if any of you happen to see his name in the list there, you as attendees right now are able to unmute yourself if need be. So Danny Barris, are you here? I don't think he is. Austin Raymond, are you here? How about Oliver DiDonato? Or Matt Garrett? Hey, Matt Garrett is here. At least his icon says he's here. Matt, you want to say something about y'all's poster? Or Michael? Or any of these Simpson/Loris people? Oh, sorry. Yep. Now I had the setting backwards. My bad. You are allowed to unmute yourself now.
Okay. No, thanks, Russ, and good morning, everyone. So yes, in the afternoon poster session, a group of students from Loris College and Simpson College, we have done some research on the adding of NCAA division sports at the NCAA Division III level. We investigated about a 18-month window of really what is a increased phenomenon at those schools. We kind of looked at just the characteristics of what sports were being added. And then my colleague, Michael Thompson, actually your colleague, Dr. Michael Thompson at Central, did a Vader text analysis when we really investigated the quotes that official university administrators were using when announcing the reasons for this, which really deals with increasing enrollment.
Awesome. Thanks for that. That was the perfect elevator presentation there. Matthew Kim, are you here? If you want to unmute yourself, you can talk about y'all's poster.
Hi, I'm Matthew Kim. So we're from the University of West Florida. We're in Pensacola, Florida. So our poster, we look at a bunch of different methods for ranking NFL teams in the postseason. So we just go over pretty much any method you can think of, like Massey, Colley, offense, defense, Markov method. And then we introduce a few new ones. So similar to how like the Markov method comes from like a sort of like a web page ranking algorithm, PageRank. We introduce hits and co-hits, and then we look at those for ranking sports teams. But yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing that too. And Eric Hall, I see you're here. If you want to unmute yourself, excuse me.
Yeah, so I decide to answer the question, can we, predict the Heisman Trophy winner? So specifically, this is with college quarterbacks. So trained some data from 2006 to 2018, specifically looking at quarterbacks.
An excellent job not spoiling any results that you may have found, because who knows who's going to win it this year. So
sure.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Eric. Let me go back for a second here. So Danny Barris, Austin Raymond, Oliver DiDonato. I don't think any of them are here, but if y'all are here, last call.
Yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Austin Raymond. I'm a senior at the Honors College at Towson University in Maryland. Basically, for my project, we use linear regression and stepwise regression to assess the most viable predictors in NCAA men's D1 basketball and whether offensive or defensive metrics are the most predictive of overall team success.
Lovely. Awesome. Thank you all. I think that's everybody that's here. And I think we're actually good to go to roll into our keynote. So again, even during the keynotes or other things, if you want to put things in chat, you can message me directly. You can put questions into the chat if you'd like, but I do ask that you keep yourself muted so that we can all hear the speaker pretty well. So Seth, if you want to go ahead and get yourself set up, you can unmute yourself and get ready to go here. I'll make sure we're looking okay with that. Austin, you're awesome. And you got yourself unmuted too?
Yes, sir.
Lovely. All right. Well, cool. Well, let's get into it then. I am really excited to introduce Seth Partnow. He is the Director of North American Sports at StatsBomb. So I think I've put the link to that website in a variety of places on our materials. So go check out StatsBomb. But that's he's the Director of North American Sports for StatsBomb, where he oversees the creation and development of the company's football and basketball products. He's also a regular contributor to The Athletic, which I'm a subscriber to that. It's fun to read, in written and podcast form. Seth is the former Director of Basketball Research for the Milwaukee Bucks. He is the author of The Mid-Range Theory, Basketball's Evolution in the Age of Analytics. He's got an economics degree from Carleton College nearby here in Northfield, Minnesota. He's a graduate from the University of Minnesota Law School, lives in the Milwaukee area with his wife, his 2 kids, and 3 cats. Seth, really happy to have you here. I will put it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Russ. Thanks for having me. If you can you make it so I can I can turn my camera on also? For whatever reason, it's not letting me do that. Hopefully everyone
can
can
now.
Cool. Morning, everyone. If you as Russ said, I'm Seth Partnow. One quick sort of housekeeping note: if you see my scene, if you see my screen start to shake, or I bust out the handy dandy water squirter, it's because some of my cats think my laptop is a great scratching post and might try to attack it. So that's obviously tough during a presentation. So hopefully you'll bear with me if that happens. In terms of the talk, the brief that Russ gave me for what to talk about was, I wanted to know a little bit about my path in sports analytics, a little bit about what I've done, and maybe some examples of work in the field. And the thing that came back to me about that was telling stories. I think that over the course of today, we're going to hear a lot about methodology and tools, and certainly I think Brian when McDonald, when he talks this afternoon, we'll dig into some of that. And I think that's all vitally important and necessary for work in the field of sports analytics. But given that I think there's probably a lot of students here, I think that the importance of that sort of the last mile, the telling the story with the data. There's an expression I often use with people who've worked for me in the past is the numbers don't say, you say. Which is by way of saying that a spreadsheet doesn't convince anybody. It's the story you use to tell and how you illustrate what the data, the analysis, the methodology you've used, how that affects the underlying subject. In this case, that's sports. I'm coming at this from the background of someone who has worked for a team, and these are genuine experts who have dedicated their life to basketball. And just because numbers guy says is not a good enough reason for them to change behavior in any way. So I would have to tell a story in terms of basketball. So to that end, I wanted to interweave sort of my own story with the story of things that were kind of going on in the broader sports analytics world, and hopefully use that to draw out some lessons about both the importance of understanding how to tell a story and the stories that you tell. So like I said, a little bit about me, a little bit about what's going on in the world, some anecdotes, a few charts, I think actually one, and a tiny bit of math, because it wouldn't be I've been told that if I don't have a single equation, it's not really a sports analytics talk. So I think I have 2 in here. So again, who I am, I'm the director, as Russ said, I am the director of North American sports at StatsBomb. I was originally hired to kick off the basketball product there, but we were also doing American football at the time. And as I will get to a little later, football's really hard. And so 2.5 years later, that's still been my focus. As said, I currently appear some at The Athletic, as well as write and occasionally podcast for Dunked On. Was the director of basketball research for the Milwaukee Bucks. Before that, I did a lot of different things. One of the most important stories that I get asked about a lot is, how did you get into sports analytics, and how does that what lessons that offer for my path? Hopefully, as I talk about my path, the answer to what lessons that offers me is essentially none. My path is completely non-replicable, and I think that's probably much more true for people of sort of my generation of sports analysts than it is now that the field has gotten a little bit more mature. I'm very much a generalist. And so just a list of sort of my previous activities and careers should illustrate that this is not in any way a straight path to getting to where I've been. I actually the career in sports analytics is very much a happy accident. I started doing actual analysis using statistical tools mostly as a hobby when my first child was born, because it was basically free and I could do it at home while while watching a game and rocking a baby, essentially. And before that, as you can see, I did a number of different things. I've been an educational consultant. I played poker professionally. I went to law school and practiced law for a couple of years. I have worked at startups. I've been laid off at startups. I've had to do temp jobs. And prior to do that, I was a student athlete at Carleton, as Russ mentioned. I should say I was you could say I played, but it was more that I was on the team. There's, even at the Division III level, there is not a lot of playing time available for a undersized two guard with questionable defensive skills and shot selection that can be described as aggressive. But I was on the team. I hold a record for the NCAA. Never missed a free throw. I'm still very proud of that. The most important part of that for me was I played for a coach, or was on the team for a coach who was technically excellent in sort of teaching the X's and O's of basketball. So I learned a ton about basketball from a strategic standpoint, which has served me well throughout my career, alongside sort of the degree in economics. Those were turns out a useful combo in terms of being able to analyze and explain basketball. Things that were happening in the world at the time. I graduated from college in 1999. Perhaps the most important development at that time was the NBA for the 96-97 introduced a new play-by-play feed, or a detailed play-by-play feed, which included stuff such as shot locations, times of events, information about who had subbed in and out of a game. Before this, we were basically limited to the box score. So if you think about it, you could not even do basic lineup analysis other than knowing who started the game on a holistic level. You could certainly hand chart games and stuff like that, but at this point, with 30 teams, there's 1,230 games in an NBA season. Nobody is watching 1,230 games and collating every substitute, and to be able to do that, so having that data provided was a pretty massive step forward in terms of what one could actually analyze in basketball. An interesting side note, and this is sort of an important lesson here, is that first season of data is actually pretty bad. I think that basically no one actually uses at this point to illustrate, especially in terms of shot locations, which, again, this is where the first of the now very well-known shot charts came about. Perfect illustration is in that first year, which was the second to last championship of Michael Jordan's career. According to this data, he shot about 51% at the rim and 49% from mid-range. Now, if you know that today the best players tend to shoot in the upper 60s, maybe 70s at the rim, the best finishing players, and this is Michael Jordan in his heyday we're talking about, that seems off. And for the sort of the next year, the final season of his Bulls career, when this data started to get a bit more accurate, it ended up it turned out that he that year shot around 62% at the rim and about 40% from mid-range, which indicates to me, and this is a phenomenon that's true of a ton of players between the 96-97 and 97-98 season, that there was just the shot location data was off, and so sort of a lot of shots that occurred at the rim, especially made shots, were being, for whatever reason, assigned to mid-range areas. So this was an important lesson in just like doing exploratory data analysis and some QA checks on what you're actually working with, because if you don't actually do that, you can do perfectly good coding, perfectly good math, but since you're working with garbage data, you get garbage results, and that can lead to many bad things. As I mentioned, this new data allowed for a lot of new analysis. And part of the reason I talk about stories is this is a lesson from Daniel Kahneman of Thinking Fast and Slow fame, or if you've read The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, sort of a good intro into Kahneman and his partner Amos Tversky's behavioral economics work. But something he said is that the human brain is not especially well suited to take on statistical information without a narrative attached to it. You need to tell a story. And there's lots of plausible stories you can tell. For example, this was a common thing you would hear commentators say kind of throughout the 90s and even into the early 2000s about, a player would miss a catch and shoot 3-pointer and say they'd say something like, "Oh, why don't you take one dribble in and get an easier 2-point shot?" Now, there's nothing implausible or illogical about that bit of advice. It stands to reason that the closer you are to the basket, the more likely you are to make a shot. And to some degree that is true, but from a standpoint of basketball analysis, while it's logically coherent, it is empirically incorrect. One of those things that we learned once we had detailed shot location data, so we could compare how often a 17-foot jumper goes in to how often a 24-foot jumper goes in, is that there's not actually that much difference. This is data from just the last 10 seasons, because that's what I had handy on my laptop. But it's you can duplicate this over any period from essentially 97 on, and it'll be functionally the same. There'll be some variations around the rim just because as methods of collection have changed. Shot distances around the rim have altered slightly, but essentially you get a chart that looks basically like this. And yes, there's a little bit of a drop off from around the free throw line to just beyond the arc, but it doesn't take a math genius to know that 1.5 times 38% is much more than 1 times 42%, give or take. And so this realization that actually taking that step in, even if it makes the shot go in a little bit more, is actually costing your team, because as long as you're a competent shooter out to 3, that extra point is more than enough to offset that small decline in accuracy. So this essentially, this is why NBA teams started shooting threes. Essentially, it's like, oh, it's better empirically rather than theoretically. So moving on from that into the early aughts, as I said, I graduated from college in '99. Worked at a startup. The startup went under. Temp job. Went back to law school. That was around the time I lost touch a little bit with the NBA. For those who were around then, the early 2000s were sort of the post-Jordan era, were pretty ugly. You had finals games in the 70s, and I don't know if there's a right score for basketball to be played, but I do know that in a 48-minute game, games being played in the 70s is the wrong one. I sort of replaced basketball with a raging addiction to, if for those who are familiar with the game, Football Manager. It used to be called at the time called Championship Manager. It's a very detailed, extremely detailed, massively detailed soccer simulator, soccer management simulator. And it basically sucked up hours and hours and days and months of time. So it replaced sort of some of the basketball fandom. In the world, sports analytics started to take off in this time. Moneyball was published in 2003. Dina Oliver published Basketball on Paper. He's, by the way, just announced that he is finally 20 years later writing a follow-up to it. I'm very much looking forward to that. Using some of the lineup data that was available from play-by-play, methodology known as adjusted plus minus, and in short terms, that is essentially controlling for who you're playing with and against. How much of an impact does an individual player have in moving the scoreboard in the direction that favors their team? Now, there's a lot of different ways to define whether how good a player is. That seems like one of the best ones, as far as I'm concerned, is scoreboard moving in your favor, probably good. There were some defensive rule changes that the NBA imposed in around physicality on the perimeter, illegal defense rules, and such, and so on like that, to address some of the aesthetics problems that were around at that time. So let me, and story about that is, as I said, the introduction of play-by-play data allows you to know a lot more about basketball, a ton more. But in terms of really impacting how the game is managed, how it's played, not quite enough. Again, that adjusted plus minus methodology could give you an estimate of who is good and maybe some indication of how good, but that's just the what. And the classic example is there's a player for the Seattle Supersonics and later Oklahoma City Thunder named Nick Collison, who was not a high scorer, not a big rebounder, did not put up big stats, but his team almost for the prime of his career was almost always much better with him on the floor, controlling for who he was playing with and against. And all right, Nick Collison is a very effective player. Why? And with all you're working with is play-by-play, you completely cannot answer that. You might offer some theories. Some of them are he was a great screen setter. He was regarded as a very good positional defender, even if he didn't do a lot of the traditional sort of defensive big man things like block a lot of shots. And there's also kind of a statistical artifact to it in that a way you can look relatively good in some of those methodologies is you're sort of splitting time with a player who's bad. So when you come on the floor, better things happen. And it's sometimes hard to tell how much of that is sort of just filling the hole from a poor player to the excellence of the players actually come in the game. So a lot of those things probably played into Collison's showing up well on those stats, but we didn't really know. So it's hard to make that actionable. It's hard to tell someone why. Why would you want a player like that? What other players offer the same thing? And it was again hard to know. Continuing on the timeline, from 2005 to 2008, 2007 really, I practiced law. I hated it. I had already discovered in law school that I was good at poker. You may notice that on my sort of CV, it's pretty light on sort of formal math stats training. I like to say that playing poker for a living was a PhD level course in applied statistics. In that I had to be able to take on a lot of information about opponents and essentially tell myself a compelling narrative about what they might do, how they were playing, and how that should affect my responses. And if you don't do that well enough, then you lose, and a professional poker player who is not able to win is actually just known as broke. So being able to do that well served me in great stead. I was also this sort of started my path directly to the NBA in that through kind of the poker community, I started playing in very in-depth dynasty fantasy leagues. It turned out there was two other future NBA execs in this fantasy league. None of us who had any real connections. We all sort of kind of got in through side and back doors. In the broader world, the Sloan Conference was established and became kind of the sports nerd event, and had largely because it was founded and managed by Daryl Morey, then of the Rockets, now of the 76ers. Actually, he may have still been with the Celtics when it started. I don't recall exactly. Anyway, it had a very much, and still does, has a fairly heavy basketball focus. The adjusted plus minus and his sort of progeny started to gain some acceptance in the public sphere, a little bit within teams, but again, some of the barriers that I mentioned earlier continue to make it difficult to really get buy-in there. That said, teams had started to hire analytics staff. Dean Oliver worked for teams, Roland Beach, who founded the website 82 Games, a number of other sort of luminaries in the field. Dan Rosenbaum, who's one of the sort of originators of adjusted plus minus as well. And in the late 2000s into 2010, there started to become experiments with what has become known as tracking data. Essentially, it's the early iterations of it essentially reduced each player on the court to a dot and captured the positions of those dots and identified which player it was and the ball many times a second. It ended up the frame rate of the system that was eventually adopted, called SportView, tracked players 30 times a second. Now, this offered a lot of promise, but people weren't totally sure what to make of it because the dots are moving in pretty patterns. What does it mean? And we'll get to that in a little bit. But over this time period, the play of the NBA, it changed a lot. And one of this is really the start of the 3-point revolution, with Mike D'Antoni noting that three is more than two. Playing fast is better than playing slow, and putting the ball in your best player's hand instead of sharing it is a good way to run an offense. And use that combined with Steve Nash, and took advantage of the rule changes that I mentioned earlier that allowed a smaller, less physically imposing player like Nash to benefit. Whereas, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the game had turned into more of a contest of strength than of skill. But the rule changes allowed that to change, and that changed the way basketball was played forever, or at least until this point. Maybe we'll go back at some point. That depends as much on the rules and sort of competitive environment as anything else. So moving on into the early 2010s, this is where I got into sports analytics as a hobby and then a profession. And really, the at least in basketball, the investment exploded. As I mentioned, the SportView system earlier, it was actually a technology developed as an offshoot of what was a ballistic missile tracking system, and they turned it into tracking players first on a soccer field and then on a basketball court. And this was installed for the 13-14 season in NBA Arena. So we are now in our 11th season of having tracking data for the NBA. And over that 10 years, we've learned a ton. If folks remember, 2012 was when Linsanity, Jeremy Lin's amazing run of games with the New York Knicks happened. And that actually was somewhat formative for me in terms of doing basketball analysis, as we'll get to in a second. And with the explosion in this technology, NBA teams started to invest more, simply because as moved from kind of play-by-play, which play-by-play you can kind of work with in Excel or other spreadsheet forms, and it doesn't necessarily require a whole ton of technical skill to work with. Once we moved to the tracking data, that went out the window. The number of data points, like in a using play-by-play in a game, is, depending on how you want to count, it's somewhere between 500 or 600, or maybe as many as a couple thousand, depending on how you want to count the data points. Using SportView tracking, which is just one dot for player in the ball 30 times a second, there are just under 1 million data points per game. So it's maybe not quite in the realm of big data, but certainly medium data. And you can't even open a game of tracking data, let alone a season, in Excel, just because it's too much. So that meant that more and more technically skilled people were needed to use this data, and the NBA, in fits and starts, and some teams faster than others, responded accordingly. So I mentioned Linsanity, and this was one of the first big pieces of analysis I did. It was completely unprecedented in a player who was undrafted, on basically signed off the street, gets put into a game, very kind of Roy Hobbs in the natural style, and all of a sudden is scoring 30 points every game, and the Knicks, which had been struggling mightily, suddenly are beating the best teams. And it was partially because it was the Knicks, partially because it was a player who went to Harvard, who had come out of nowhere. This was a sensation, and as such, in sort of that time period, as now, we started to get some outlandish statements. Steve Nash was still in his late prime at this point, had won 2 MVPs in the early 2000s, and some of Linsanity's numbers, or some of Lynn's numbers over this period, compared favorably. He for example, he turns the ball over too much. Well, he turns the ball over at the same rate as Nash did, and this struck me as wrong because while Lynn was doing a ton of scoring, he wasn't doing nearly the playmaking that Nash did for those Suns teams, where he basically, when he was on the floor, essentially everything ran through him. And this to me represented I mentioned there would be some math. Here's some. A problem with the existing metric we had, turnover percentage, which was the measure we were using. Excuse me. Does not account for playmaking at all. As you can see the formula here, it's just turnovers plus scoring attempts. The sort of standard way to convert free throws into scoring attempts using NBA data is multiplying free throw attempts times 0.44. Using play-by-play data, you can get to a more exact number. People basically don't bother because it is essentially, for most players, it's a variation of like 2 to 3 scoring attempts per year at most. So it's easier just to simplify using the box score stats. But in any event, playmaking is completely unaccounted for. The only thing that can happen when you're trying to create for a teammate with respect to your turnover percentage is bad. You can complete the pass and it shows up as nothing, or you can turn the ball over, in which case it's held against you. Which means paradoxically, one of the best ways to lower your turnover rate is to shoot the ball more. And that seems kind of counterintuitive as a way of measuring players. But we'll get back to this. Moving on, in 2014, after I'd been writing on my own for a time, the website Nylon Calculus was founded and started to flourish. I think there are still at least upwards of a dozen Nylon Calculus alums who are still working in NBA front offices and analytics roles and above. And in 2016, I got hired by the Milwaukee Bucks. We'll talk about that a little bit, but I'll be a little more circumspect about that for I think what should be obvious reasons. Analytics groups started to explode in terms of size. That's how someone like me got hired. And the tracking data really revolutionized basketball analysis. And this is, you'll hear a lot about tracking data if you're plugged into sports analysis. And the thing is people don't actually, for the most part, care about tracking data itself. The dots are neat, but they matter less than the events you can derive from those dots. For example, the Second Spectrum, which was the company that eventually took over the NBA's tracking provider up until this year, created a series of files called markings. And the markings were essentially, as their CEO at the time described it, were basketball words in the data. So the dots moving in this direction represents a pick and roll. It's a pick and roll with player A as the ball handler, player B as the screener. It's a pick and roll with player A as the ball handler, player B as the screener. At this point on the court, at this time on the clock, with this much time on the shot clock, defended in a certain way, with certain actions taken, a certain outcome. Having all of that at your fingertips is a massive increase in what you can know about basketball in terms of the sport. And we'll get back to this in a second. But I wanted to one of the things this tracking provided is a way to kind of finish the story on Linsanity. We've known for a long time that the so-called usage efficiency trade-off, which is the more shots a player takes, the marginal shot they're taking is likely harder. You can take about one shot every 10 to 12 trips down the court if all you're going to do is take layups and open corner threes. That's fine, but if every player on your team did that, that would still leave half the possessions unaccounted for. So someone has to do something harder, and essentially the bigger share of shots you take up, the harder those attempts become. With this markings data, we saw a similar thing for passing. The more often a player made what have come to be known as productive passes, potential assists, shot passes where whether the shooter makes the shot or not, an assist would be awarded. The more often a player does that, the more kind of bad pass turnovers they tend to have, which is a similar thing. If all you're doing is throwing passes to wide open players, you can probably get around, a potential assist every 25 trips down the floor. If you're doing more than that, you're having to make harder plays. You're going to have to make the defense move around. You're going to have to throw passes with some risk. And so a player who is playmaking at Nash's volume is doing harder things than Jeremy Lin was. So all this is a roundabout way of saying a metric I developed that called true turnover percentage included these potential assists in the denominator. So remember when I mentioned before that a playmaking attempt is can only be a bad thing because you either had a turnover or a nothing. Adding this in now means you increase the denominator and thus lower your observed turnover rate by completing a pass to a player who then takes what is generally speaking a better shot than one they would have to create themselves. And on this metric, Nash was a substantially superior in terms of turnover prevention than Jeremy Lin, which sort of matched more of an eye test, more of an observation of the game about which player had better ball security and is a better and as such is a better way of measuring and observing the game. From some stories from this time, one thing I discovered is that corner threes are more accurate, generally because they're more open. This is not analysis that's possible to do in public anymore. At one point, the detailed shot data was available that allowed you to look at this, but somewhere between 88 and 90% of corner threes are uncontested, and that is compared with about 50-50 on above the break threes. And that's the biggest reason why corner threes are more desirable and more accurate for the most part. All of the things on this page have an asterisk because there are some caveats. There are some players for whom the 1.5 foot extra distance between above the break and the corners matters. There's some players who have corner three range and not above the break range. And those players are actually pretty limited because there aren't many players who get more than about 2 corner three attempts a game. So it's nice to be able to do that, but it's not does not a viable offensive player make. Something that's been discovered and was known, I think, back into the mid 2000s is that a defensive output is a lot. It can be very beholden to what we call the make or miss league. No matter how well or poorly you defend a player will miss a lot of jump shots just because. A wide open player, an average NBA player wide open at the arc will make around 40% of them in the present environment. Does that mean you get credit as a defender if you happen to be closest and they were one of the 3 and 5 that missed? I don't think so. And that's sort of borne out in the numbers in that as the closest defender on jumpers, it's not really a skill that persists and is repeatable, which suggests that it is largely variance. this came to be known as sort of Jedi defense. A team would be quote unquote performing well on defense, and then you'd look, and over the time stretch, opponents were shooting like 28% from three. And it's like, okay, maybe they're doing something right, but opponents are also just missing shots. By comparison, especially for big men, what the percentage of shots they allow to be made at the rim is persistent, and thus represents a skill which has come to be known as rim protection. And finally, I mentioned earlier that playing off the pass is easier than trying to create it yourself. It's about 8 to 10 points of effective field goal percentage, which works out to about 1 to 2 tenths essentially of points per shot. Now the gap is probably larger than that in actuality, in that self-created shots tend to be highly concentrated in the best players. And if they were evenly distributed across all players, I think the gap would probably be larger, in that there would be worse players trying to do things they were less capable of doing. From my time at the Bucks, some more private stories. Big picture, as I mentioned, that the tracking data is super important. You were able to, when we were working with play-by-play data, we were simply telling economic stories almost, and having this data on drives, on pick and rolls, on closeouts, on defensive matchups, on passes, on offensive rebounds, on every action you can imagine. Maybe not every, but the bulk of actions you can imagine in a basketball game. We had catalog statistically that allowed you to talk about basketball in basketball terms. There's some stories that shouldn't be told. Now, the least favorite thing I had to do every year with the Bucks was do comparisons for draft prospects, and there are two reasons for this. One is sort of obvious, and one is more subtle. The obvious one is, as soon as you say, as a college player, his profile resembles that of Steph Curry. This creates an anchor in the mind of the executive, and it's just all they say, oh, he's the next Steph Curry. And there's just nothing you can do to combat that. And that's, obviously very dangerous. And the subtle part of that is it does not account for kind of what happened in between. Steph Curry, the draft prospect, becomes Steph Curry, the inner circle Hall of Fame player. In a hypothetical world where we could run his career 100 times, I think it's safe to say that we are well above median in terms of career outcomes. And every player, no matter how good they were as a prospect, who goes on to become an all-star level player, got much better in the time in between. And comparing to college performance does not really address that pathway. And the biggest thing was there's often frustration about why analytic learnings are not incorporated more quickly into sports. And it's because the decision maker is operating with half a dozen or more different strands of information that are all relevant and all in sort of different units. For example, in a draft situation, fine, you have a draft model that issues a prediction about a player. You also have a medical report on the player. You also have your trained scouts who have certainly observed the player. You have character and background information. You have personality and psychological information. You have who is on your team. What are positional needs? I'm not a big advocate of drafting for need, but it does not make sense to draft a player who has no path to playing time. So how do you weigh all those things together? It's hard, and it's sort of unsurprising that as sort of the new kid on the block, it's taken statistical information a while to gain some primacy there. Some specific projects I worked on there that I can talk about now because it's been far enough away, and multiple coaching staff's difference. At one point we were giving up too many corner threes. And so the analysis we did was using the tracking data. We found that our closeout defenders were we're farther away from the corner at the time the pass went to the corner than for any other team in the league, which meant that we were doing a worse job of closing out because we had more to do. We created a model of shot probability, by which I mean the probability that a player would take a catch and shoot three, based on where they were around the arc when they caught the ball, defensive pressure, the player's own movement, time on the clock, things like that. And that was a way to evaluate which players had the highest willingness to shoot the ball regardless of defensive pressure, and which players could be more easily deterred. This was both useful as sort of an internal metric saying, hey, are we creating the right touches, or are we just not shooting the ones we're creating? But also as a scouting tool. For example, Boris Diaw of the Spurs at the time was a player who would never shoot a three if there's anyone anywhere close to him. I don't say never, but pretty much never. To the point where I sort of flippantly suggested a fine for any player who bought a pump fake from him from three, because if you're close enough to him want a pump fake, he's not shooting. Similarly, we used similar data to build an expected fouls drawn model. The player like Giannis Antetokounmpo, who creates a lot of contact, being able to evaluate whether he's getting a good whistle or not is, I don't know if it's useful, but it is certainly information people are interested in. And finally, I mentioned that earlier that Mike D'Antoni realized that playing faster was good. You could prove this empirically. However you want to define a team getting into an offense, they score more readily, and that persists throughout a possession. So every second earlier you get into your offense, whether that's crossing half court, entering the ball, or first action, it's worth around a point of offensive rating, which on a single possession, it's 0.01 points. Not that big an impact, but it's something that over the course of a game can be pretty impactful. Going from the slowest team in this regard in the NBA to the fastest team, it's probably worth on its own around 5 wins a season. And then sort of getting us to present, I went back to the public sphere at The Athletic. I wrote a book, as Russ mentioned. I am working on a second book. It's going slowly, but it's going. And now I work primarily in data creation rather than data analysis. Things happen in the world. COVID, we're doing this remotely still. I mentioned that the analytics sphere has reached a level of maturity in that, generally speaking, teams are no longer hiring one person to do it all. They're hiring a data engineer and an analyst and a software developer, and for all these different roles, because the field is very broad and it encompasses a lot of different technologies and activities. And that represents, I think, a certain level of maturity in the field. And that's why the pathways to getting into the industry are much different now than even 10 years ago when I was getting into it. I don't recommend this as a learning tool, but certainly as a aid in doing stuff in production. ChatGPT and other large language models are very useful as coding assistants, have largely replaced Stack Overflow. And finally, this year, I think we are eventually going to see another sea change in analysis, in that we are getting pose data for the first time. Instead of it being, we not public yet, teams are, but instead of one dot that represents the players, it's a couple dozen that represent various joints. So with a little bit of processing, you could actually observe jump shooting form and observe variations in jump shooting form. This has a lot of applications, especially in sort of sports science and injury prevention, I think, because it allows for near real-time analysis of how an athlete's moving. And that's pretty exciting, but also daunting. So as I wrap up and move towards questions, a little bit about what I'm doing now. the data needs of each sport are very different. Maybe it's because I come from basketball, but football data is significantly harder. The combination of there's a much smaller sample size. An NBA team will have tens of thousands of possessions in a season. A football team will have 600, 700, 800 plays in the season. It's just a much different, much smaller sample size. And because of the nature of football, where everything can be so highly scripted, the margin for error in terms of measuring things is much lower. Even using tracking data, there's a little bit of wiggle in terms of where a dot is actually placed. Center mass of a player is sometimes hard to determine. But in basketball, if a player is a foot forward, a foot back, foot left, foot right, for the most part, that evens out over time. In a smaller sample size and in a sport like football, where certainly a pre-snap alignment, that 1 foot can make a huge schematic difference in what's happening, that they just need to be much more precise on that. This is also working on the data creation collection side has influenced to me that I strongly recommend people who are working in the field to, even if it's going to like a high school game or something like that, and charting your own stats for a little bit will give you a much better appreciation for how hard it is and just how much of an abstraction the statistics can be, and why it's important to keep that in mind. Sports are full of edge cases. Is this thing A or thing B? Both are plausible answers. You kind of need to make a decision and stick with it and be consistent. And finally, working in sort of a professional space and data creation, we would never release anything if we were waiting for everything to be perfect. So figuring out when, this applies to analysis, it applies to everything else. Figuring out when good enough is good enough. You're sort of battling accuracy against timeliness, and but you have to balance those two things against each other. The thing I'll say in terms of lessons I've learned is, I mentioned the importance of a narrative tied to statistics to get your point across. It's not everything; it's the only thing. The story has to be coherent. I think a mistake that younger analysts make a bunch is they try to tell you everything instead of telling one story at a time. There's an expression going back to my law school days, and both for law school exams and for preparing for the bar exam. And it's a phrase. It's called the call of the question. What am I being asked? What if whether it's a question I've asked myself or I've been asked? That's the important thing. It's maybe the venue of the question is shot quality, but that's not an invitation to here's everything I know about shot quality. Here's how I can answer the specific question about how good shot quality a player or poor shot quality a player has in a given situation, if that's what's being asked. Knowing what's in the data, earlier I talked about how the 96, 97 play-by-play data was kind of a mess, and so we don't use it anymore. Knowing that it was unreliable and knowing why, and so it might be useful for some purposes and not others, is pretty key. And that ties in with knowing your subject matter. Can save yourself from major embarrassment by just having a sort of a sniff test of, well, that doesn't seem right. But have I done something wrong in my code, or is my data bad? Rather than announcing a new discovery to a world that might be based on either faulty data or you having a reversed sign somewhere in your code, which is massively embarrassing. I think that gets us to about the end of my prepared. Hopefully, I've left a couple minutes for questions. Ways to get in touch with me: you can email me at StatsBomb. Seth Partnow on social apps. And in terms of reading or listening to me on pods, The Athletic, Dunked on Prime, my podcast partner Mo Dakhil and I do a watch along on Monday nights on Playback, and I think the Mid-Range Series is a pretty good book. So yeah, I think it left some time for questions. So let's go from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Seth. Let's go ahead and give the virtual round of applause with your Zoom, if you would. Feel free to put anything in chat if you'd like. And I'll kick off Q&A while folks think about, maybe what they want to ask. Feel free in a second if you want to either unmute or if you want to put your questions in the chat, that'd be fine. Seth, quick question.
Yes.
The anchorage bias, can you say a little bit about that?
The anchoring bias?
Anchoring bias.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're the Anchorage.
I'm the Anchorage man.
man.
I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska. So that's what
yeah.
So that's essentially you have an initial impression of what a player is. And if we're talking in Bayesian terms, that can be an extremely strongly held prior, and it's just impossible to unsee that. The example I gave was, Steph Curry. I hated doing draft comps for that reason, because who am I comparing it to? And then it's like you provide a range of comparisons, and invariably it's going to be the best. The top end of the range is going to be the one that gets focused on, right. And that's just impossible to unsee for many people, no matter how much you try to avoid it. And so I would prefer to just not even introduce that anchor, but it's still something that I think that most execs actually demand, and I hate it.
Cool. What questions are there from others here today?
Hi, Seth. This is Jackson. Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to ask, just to get your perspective on this. I've thought about in basketball, there's certainly every team is shooting more threes. It seems to be kind of a similar style. And I saw something interesting from Kirk Goldsberry about making the paint thinner to try to make getting closer to the basket more attractive. And one idea I had, just curious what your reaction would be, what if basketball implemented a spot foul? So if you got fouled, you could take your shot from where you got fouled for 2 points rather than having to go to the free throw line. Just curious your instant reaction to that. Thank you.
That is interesting. I'd have to think about that. That would be fascinating. That would certainly be something that I think 6 or 7 years ago, actually the WNBA put on what they called an analytics scrimmage, where they had two teams and they experimented with a number of different kind of rule changes in various periods of the scrimmage. And I think that would be an idea. That would be a fantastic thing to test in that regard. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I don't know if it certainly changes the incentives around fouling, around how you play defense. Don't foul a jump shooter suddenly becomes much less problematic if they've still got to make a 19-footer. As good as NBA players will shoot uncontested from 19 feet. As at present, basically, if you foul a jump shooter, you turn a contested 19-footer into a layup, since an NBA player will shoot high 70s, low 80s from the free throw line. And that is a similar efficiency to like a semi-contested layup. So I don't know if that would be a good or bad thing in terms of how it would change sort of the incentives to play defense. And then you sort of have knock-on effects like landing zone fouls and stuff like that. If we want to have sprained ankles from, players getting crowded that much on the perimeter as they're shooting, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. That's a great question. I'd have to think about it a lot more.
Seth, I'll follow up on that one actually with a similar question. Like the spot foul idea is intriguing. It makes me think of pass interference in football. But going back to the NBA though, what did you think a few years ago? We actually had Nick Elam give a talk a few years ago here at MSAM. What did you think about the Elam ending, like in the NBA All-Star game, and maybe the idea of that being adopted in some areas?
I'm a fan of the Elam ending. I think that I would like to see it used for overtime. I think that the overtime in regular season games, I think that given the sort of the time window that a basketball game takes up and the worry about sort of load management, and I think that the suggestion that I think is probably right, that overtime is probably a dangerous environment from an injury standpoint, given that where all the athletes are on their kind of acute load over the course of the game. So shortening that in the regular season, I don't think it's sort of like a game many times in the regular season, a game goes to overtime is a loss for both teams almost. Because even the team that wins it might be in trouble their next game based on sort of having to play the extra time. And if we start talking about double and triple overtime, even more so. And I think from a regular season standpoint, and in terms of making a TV show, which really professional sports is, I think that, keeping games into a tighter window in the regular season, I think is a very good endeavor, and deal amending is, I think, a good way to get to that.
Yeah, and I have particular thoughts on that too. I just remember when that was introduced in the All-Star game a few years ago. That was the best fourth quarter of an All-Star game I've ever seen in my life, because the players were actually playing defense. They were actually playing hard. But I'll also speak as a college coach. I help coach our women's soccer team, and the NCAA in the regular season just removed overtime for soccer. Now, soccer, you can have ties, but they removed overtime in the regular season for college soccer until you get to the tournament time. And I can speak from firsthand experience that it does make a difference, that extra bit of overtime or that extra wear and tear very much impacts the players, impacts your team, impacts performance, for the next game, for example. So I think your points there are pretty relevant. Any other thoughts out there? Any other questions from the mob? Looks like Michael Loper has his hand up. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. So I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to kind of shift gears, so I'm sorry to people that are interested more in the basketball crowd, but I think you kind of undersold your athletic ability in the regards of ultimate. Playing on Carlton Cut in Sub-Zero is quite an accomplishment, and I kind of wanted to go on that train. I'm wondering if you've looked at any kind of looking at sports analytics in like the AUDL or anything like that. I know that college and club ultimate's probably a little bit harder to find stats on, but I'm wondering if you had either any thought, done any small projects on ultimate, or if you think, and if you haven't, what's your opinion on like using that as kind of an entry for someone who's a little bit new to the sports analytics world?
I think that's it. That's, first of all, it's a great spot for collecting your own data. I think most of the data I've seen, it struck me as insufficient in that I think that from a strategic standpoint, now this is the field width in the AUDL being different than sort of USAU and club and college level play changes things some, but sort of the horizontal aspect of the field is super important from a strategic standpoint. Obviously, the being able to calculate like what are we losing by getting trapped on the line? What are we giving up as a defense by allowing the opposing team to swing it off the line? I think that would be that's important stuff. And so the data I've seen doesn't really account for that, and is much more tilted towards kind of vertical yard gains, which I think that's probably more important, but I think that the existing data I've seen is probably it gives an insufficient understanding of the game because it doesn't adequately take into account the horizontal element, as well as things like the force and weather conditions and stuff like that.
All right, folks, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. We are going to transition, but let's go ahead and give Seth another virtual round of applause and thank you, Seth. That was perfect. That was lovely.
So can I forgot one thing in the talk is for those who are interested in working with some fun football data, StatsBomb is releasing. We've already released the last 2 seasons of Tom Brady's career with the Bucks, with the Buccaneers, both event and tracking data. If you go to at StatsBomb_FB on Twitter, you can find links to repositories for that data that you can play around with and dive in. And I think there's some neat stuff there that allows people to dive in on football in ways that hasn't always been available in the past.
Awesome. Yeah, and if you want to throw that link in the chat, that'd be helpful too for folks. I can also put that out on our social media and stuff too a little bit. So
I will do so.
Awesome. Thank you, Seth. That was fantastic. And we are going to go ahead and transition